Ephesians 3, starting at verse 7. I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given me through the working of his power. Although I am less than the least of all God's people, this grace was given me to preach to the Gentiles the boundless riches of Christ, and to make plain to everyone the administration of this mystery, which for ages past was kept hidden in God, who created all things. His intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms, according to his eternal purpose that he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. In him, and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. I ask you, therefore, not to be discouraged because of my sufferings for you, which are your glory.
It's my real pleasure to welcome Tanya Walker to speak to us today. Tanya is Dean of the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, and it's great to have you with us today, Tanya. Tanya's going to speak on the question as to whether faith is rational, and at the end there'll be a few minutes for Q&A. The easiest way to handle that is if you would text your questions to the number that you can see on the screen, and then after we've sung a song, we'll give Tanya an opportunity to answer as many of those as we can. Tanya, thanks so much for being with us. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be with you this morning. I met Callum Harkwater, some 5-10 years ago now, and the friendship has continued. It's great to be amongst a community where he is loved and known, and to respond to the invitation to speak to this important topic, is faith rational, and see what the Lord might do with us this morning. Maybe I'll start with a quote. It's a quote you might well be familiar with. It's from Richard Dawkins, and he writes this: "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate the evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even because of, a lack of evidence." I wonder what you think about when you think about faith. The assumption in our times is that the answer to this question is a very simple no, that faith is not rational. In fact, it's categorically irrational, the same as believing in fairies at the bottom of the garden, or whatever other patronizing analogies have been put to people of faith in the world over the past years. That this is something that where you park your brain behind, and where you shut your eyes and take these leaps into the dark. But the truth is that everyone has a faith. Every human being on this planet has something by which they have put their faith in that thing and trusted to hold their lives and hold their system of beliefs, a way of looking at the world, a lens, if you like, by which to make sense of this world that we're in. And so the question is not so much, is faith irrational? Because everyone has a faith. But what faith? What faith are we talking about? You need to ask it in its specifics. Is the specific faith that is held by you or by me or by the person next to us, is that faith rational? I wonder how you came to hold the faith that you hold, and whether it is, in fact, a reasonable or a rational faith. But let me step back a little bit, and maybe I can start by asking a broader question, which is, what is true rationality? I'm going to start a little bit tongue-in-cheek with a reference to a comic strip that I enjoy about Hagar the Horrible. It's about Hagar the Viking. And in one of the comic strips, you see Hagar kneeling in prayer, and he says in somewhat agitated tones, "It's so hard to believe in you, God. We don't see you. How come you never show yourself? How do we even know that you're there?" And then in the next little caption, in the next little image, you see a flower springing to life beside Hagar. And then a volcano erupts in the distance. Then there's an eclipse of the sun, which turns the sky gray. Then there's a star shooting over the stratosphere. A tidal wave rushes over Hagar. There's lightning that's flashing. There's a burning bush. And then, oh, so significantly, a stone rolling away from an empty tomb. And Hagar picks himself up from the mud, dripping wet, surrounded by blackness, and he says, okay, I give up. Every time I raise these questions, all we get are interruptions. It's difficult to talk rationally, to talk about rationality, or to talk about faith and rationality, where the backdrop of our present culture is an unexamined philosophy that's reductionist to the point of being absurd. In a nutshell, we don't know what is to count as evidence anymore, even if we are bombarded by it. We've become confused about what is to count as legitimate forms of foundations for the beliefs that we hold. And we've picked up this particular belief that's up on the screen at the moment. In a nutshell, it's called a philosophy called scientism, but at its root, in the present Western kind of grassroots culture, if you like, this is the belief that has shaped most people's understanding of whether any given faith is rational or not. And it's the belief that the only reality, the only truth that exists is that which can be discovered through the natural sciences. The only reality, the only truth that exists is that which can be discovered through the natural sciences. And this is, if you like, the main proposal of the new atheist movement that has been so powerful and so prevalent, such a loud voice in our times. Now, there's only one little minor problem with this, which is that is the test at the heart of what is meant to make us truly rational people. If you want to know if your beliefs are rational, here's the test that tells you if they are. But the problem is, I wonder if you can see it immediately as you look at this test, where did this test come from? Where did this truth, this reality that tells us how we engage with all truth and all reality come from? Well, I'll give you a clue. It didn't come from the natural sciences, that's for sure. And so it fails its own test. This philosophy that has seemed so damning to the Christian faith, it fails its own test because that test for truth did not emerge from the natural sciences. You don't need to know anything about logical positivism or A.J. Ayer. But sadly enough, given that this lie has been so powerful in our generation, there's nothing new about this philosophy. Just less than a century ago, logical positivism, which you don't need to know anything about that philosophy other than it had a very similar test right at the heart of its message. And it was said to take the philosophical world by storm and to be the end of the Christian faith. And A.J. Ayer was the philosopher based in Oxford who was the key proponent of this philosophy, and it spread like wildfire. And he was interviewed towards the end of his life. He was interviewed by the BBC in the 1970s, talking about the impact of logical positivism and the death of faith as it had seemed to herald. And he was asked, Professor Ayer, in your opinion, what was the main weakness of your philosophy? And he answered without a hint of irony, I think the main weakness was that it was almost all entirely false. It seems to me both funny and actually extremely sad that 50 years on, we've gone back a step in our academia to put all of our trust and all of our faith in what is actually a discredited philosophy. Is faith rational? I'd like to speak a little bit about my own journey of how I became persuaded that the God of the Bible is worthy of my faith and worthy of my trust. Some time ago now, I had the privilege of hearing Alistair McGrath, he's the professor of science and religion at the University of Oxford, speak on the intersection between science and religion. And he said this quote that has stuck with me ever since. He said, science takes things apart to tell us how they work. Is there a way of putting them back together so that we might know what they mean? Science takes things apart to tell us how they work. Is there a way of putting them back together so that we might know what they mean? And it's hinting us, calling us, drawing us to recognize that there are these different layers of what it means to be truly rational. The head level, the process questions, the how questions, the science questions, if you like, the head questions. And then there are the why questions, the meaning questions, what we call the ultimate questions of life, the heart questions. And I've been asking, and I'd like us to ask this morning, is there a reality that takes all of these layers seriously? Is there a reality that speaks to all of who we are as human beings and to the complexity of our world and all of the layers that we encompass? In other words, is there a worldview? Is there a lens? Is there a faith that makes sense of the whole? And I'd like to speak to being true to the facts and then true to life. A lens, a faith that is true to the facts and then true to life. True to the facts. One of the commonplace narratives of our times is that science and faith in God are opposed, that there is an intrinsic battle there, an intrinsic misfit. But I wonder whether you've ever given that assertion much thought to see whether it can be trusted. Obviously, faith in atheism and faith in God are opposed, but the question remains, where does science fit into all of this? Those of you who've had the privilege of hearing Professor John Lennox speak, he's a professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford, he speaks so eloquently on these themes and I think gives us some very simple paradigms by which we might access what is a very complex field. He says that many of us have believed that the Christian God, when we're talking about God, what we're talking about is a God of the gaps. What we're talking about is, look, where we stumble upon an area of science or an area of knowledge that we have not yet discovered, there's a gap in our knowledge, that's where we insert God. So God is almost like a placeholder for the things we do not yet know. So in the past, for example, we didn't know where lightning comes from. And so we very conveniently had the placeholder, the God of lightning. But science over time has explained to us exactly what lightning is. And then, hey presto, we don't need God to fill that gap anymore because knowledge, science, has filled it for us. And even many Christians are mistakenly of the kind of the subconscious understanding that the God that we're speaking about is a God of the gaps, where we stumble upon a reality for which we have no rational explanation at this point in time. That's where God comes into his own, the God of the gaps. And of course, if that's your view of God, then science and God are necessarily opposed, because as science does its work of explaining the mechanisms of the world to us, we will increasingly have less and less gaps, or so the argument goes. And one day there will be no need for God. And in fact, one of the assertions of the new atheist movement is that, of course, we don't know everything yet. Of course, there are gaps in our knowledge. Of course, we can't explain everything. But one day, maybe many generations down the line, but one day we will. And so it's only a matter of time before God becomes truly redundant to human beings. But John Lennox goes on to argue there is a much better analogy, a much more profound and true analogy by which we are to understand how God fits into the universe. He talks about the Ford motor car and how absurd it would be that because we have a completely conclusive understanding of the physics that goes into making the engine work and how the Ford motor car came to be, the mechanism of it, how ridiculous it would be to suggest that we then no longer need an explanation for that car at the level of a Mr. Ford. And he talks about how conclusive mechanistic explanations, if we think they replace God, the agent explanation, all we've done is made a category mistake. We've thought that processes explain agency, and they don't. We can have a conclusive, complete, absolute understanding of everything there is to know about the mechanisms of the universe, and it still would not remove the need for an explanation at the level of God, the agent, the creator who made it come to be. These are different types of explanations, not competing, but completing one another. And my own journey has brought me to believe that science isn't just neutral about God. Science isn't just a distinct and separate field. Science leads us to God. The more that we understand about science, the more that we discover about our world, the more sure we are that some kind of super intellect must have been behind these things. And let me give you some examples. For me, part of it has come through the little bit of study on how life came to be. I don't know if you are aware that there are 11, actually the research is moving on all the time. There are more, but let's say 11 that are constants and qualities in the universe that are said to be absolutely necessary before life comes into being. And I'd like to just talk through 3 of them. The first is the gravitational constant. These are constants that exist in the universe without which life could not exist. You and I could not exist in any form. The gravitational constant, if it varied by 1 part over 10 to the 60, there would be no life. Now, if you're like me, that number means nothing to you, so let me give it to you in more visual terms. Cover America with 50p coins all the way to the moon. Cover another 1 billion continents the same size as America with 50p coins all the way to the moon. Color 1 coin red, blindfold a friend, and ask her to pick it out. The odds that she will pick out that red coin are 1 to the 10 to the 40. The gravitational constant is 1 to the 10 to the 60. Or the expansion rate of the universe, if it varied by 1 to the 10 to the 120, there would be no life. 1 to the 10 to the 120, or my personal favorite, the mass and energy of the universe. If it changed by 1 to the 10 to the 10 to the 123, there would be no life. Let me give you a visual for this number. This number is impossible to write in its normal decimal point way because there are not enough particles in the universe to write the number of zeros that would be necessary for that number. 11 such constants come together to make life possible. What is the best explanation of these facts? For me, I have become convinced that I cannot believe against every conceivable odd to the contrary that this just came about by chance. John Lennox puts it like this: the more you know about art, the more you admire Rembrandt, not the less. The more you understand about art, the more you admire Rembrandt, not the less. For me, the more I have become aware of what science tells us about the mind-blowing sophistication of this universe, the more it has made me step back in awe and wonder at the God who made it so, not the less. And it seems to me that we begin to take explanations at the cosmic level that we would never in a million years accept on Earth. Imagine if I came to you one day and I was holding an encyclopedia and you said to me, "Where did you get that from?" And I said, "Oh, well, you won't believe it, but there was an explosion just down the road." Well, actually, it was tens and tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of explosions that were going on. And it was in a printing factory, and suddenly paper and ink and glue, and it just, I know it's hugely unlikely, but somehow in one of these explanations, it just all came together, and this encyclopedia jumped into my hands. Clearly, I hope, none of you would take me seriously. None of us would take that as a rational explanation for how even one encyclopedia with its limited knowledge came to be. And it seems to me that we somewhat lose confidence in our own intellects when we write things onto the cosmic levels, explanations that we would never in a million years accept as rational here on Earth. We write into the heavens and we add a bunch of zeros and we think, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe it is rational after all. That without any God at the center, without any agent, this universe with all of its complexity came about by chance. That's true to the facts, or just some thoughts on it anyway. How about true to life? True to life. I wonder whether you'll understand what I mean when I say that I have found in myself both great heights and great depths. There are these heights, this significance, this sense of value, this sense of meaning. I feel in myself that human beings are not just a cosmic accident, that we have significance somehow. We're strange, we're the tiniest speck of dust on this cosmic landscape, and that we have this sense of sacredness even. The ancient poems of the Psalms write about this. They write, and when I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you should care for him, and yet you've placed him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. I think it's reflective of how we feel about humankind. There is this glory, there is this honor in all of our brokenness and all of this mess, this sense of significance. It is extremely hard to account for that in a world without God, this significance that is totally disproportionate to size. It's not just the heights, though, the grandeur, it's the depths. There's something that has gone horribly wrong with our world. Richard Dawkins, in his book, River Out of Eden, he writes this knockout sentence that the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. No evil, no good. I have to say, I found it hard to believe that he could be serious. I don't know what image it will be that will capture this for you. Unfortunately, we as the human race produce too many images to keep track of them. But there is one image for me that I know will never leave my consciousness, because it just so happened that my son was of such a similar age and actually a very similar look. That image of that little Turkish boy drowned at sea, washed up on shore, ISIS a living hell on one side, displacing tens of thousands of people, and an international community on the other, either unable or unwilling, somehow helpless to really make a difference. I want to suggest we need to kill off something of our humanity to say that there are no intrinsic evils in the mix. And yet Dawkins is being completely consistent within an atheistic worldview, because when you take God out of the picture, it is philosophically extremely difficult, I would say impossible, to ground objective moral values. But it's not just the depths. Actually, sometimes it's very easy for us to see the evil out there, the brokenness out there. It's not just the depths out there that bother me. I think in our quieter moments, when we're honest with ourselves, all of us experience something of a struggle within. Some years ago, I was speaking in a conference in the States, and I had the most extraordinary conversation with a woman just over lunch. I'd never met her before, but she began to speak to me about the experience of shame that she had covered for over a decade. And at one point she says, I don't think I've ever really addressed the problem before. Maybe it didn't occur to me that there was a solution. Guilt, shame. Albert Einstein apparently famously said that if he had 1 hour to solve a problem on which his life depended, he would spend 55 minutes truly understanding the problem and only 5 fixing it. Is it possible that we've completely missed the heart of the problem? Is it possible that we have not really understood ourselves? We're a generation, we're a culture very offended by the idea of guilt or by the idea of shame. We believe that these are socially constructed things put on us by other people, specifically religious people, that somehow the church in all of its religiosity has put this shame on us, had put this guilt on us. Is that really the truth of the matter? Is that really where shame comes from? Is that really where guilt comes from? It matters that we get the answer right, because we'll be solving the wrong problem if we don't. Michael Ramsden, he's the international director of the Zacharias Trust. He says something very profound about our victimhood culture, where we're very good at seeing ourselves as the victim to somebody else's wrong, but we're never the ones that are guilty. We're never the ones that have any appropriate shame. And he says the only thing we prefer to being right is being wronged, because it justifies our inner sense of self-contentment, self-righteousness. You see, some of us, we might even resonate with a God who comes to save us from the mess out there. We can just about stomach that. But a God who comes to save us from ourselves, as he claims to do, what would that even look like? What would it look like to own the guilt or to own the shame? The heights, the depths, and then our deepest longings. I remember a number of years ago, I read this extraordinary article, a series of interviews with some of the world's famous atheists, speaking about the concept of meaning. And the interviews were really just asking the question, given that atheism removes any form of meaning from the equation, how did these particular atheists ground any sense of meaning in their life? And this is the excerpt from Alam Shah. He's the author of the Young Atheist Handbook. This was his response. He said, "Yes, of course, I know that life is ultimately without meaning or purpose. But the trick is not to wake up every morning and feel that way. Cognitive dissonance, embrace it. Create a sense of meaning and purpose by doing something useful with your life. I teach being creative. I don't mean that in a Ponzi hipster way. I mean, make a curry, build some bookshelves, write a poem. And most importantly, find people you like and love and spend lots of time with them. I regularly have people over for dinner, throw parties for no other reason than I just want to spend time surrounded by the people I love. And if you're really stuck, eat rice and dal. Physically filling yourself with the food you love really does fill the emptiness you may feel inside." I remember I had to read it more than once to let the words sink in. Cognitive dissonance, embrace it. Detach your brain from the faith that you have embraced in order to make it livable. And the more that I've thought about it, the more I've begun to believe that atheism addresses the deepest longings of our hearts by explaining them away. You think you have significance, but you don't, not in any true or deep, overarching sense. We think there must be meaning to life, but there isn't. Again, not in any overarching, objective sense. You're going to have to make it for yourself. Guilt and shame, we feel them so strongly at times, but these are just culturally constrained, socially created behaviors, learned ways of thinking about things. We feel deeply our brokenness at times in a way that makes us think that something has gone horribly wrong with our world, but this is just the natural process of evolution. We shouldn't be too worried about it. This is just evolution working its way out. Atheism addresses the deepest longings of our heart by explaining them away. To become a Christian is to experience the joy of no longer needing to explain away, but simply to explain. We feel we have significance and intrinsic worth because we were made by God Almighty, who loves us and made us in his image. We feel that our lives have meaning because he made each of us for a purpose. We feel deeply our guilt and shame sometimes because we were made for connection with this God, and we turned our backs on him and broke that connection. And we feel that this world is broken because we're told that that process broke us. That is why, for me, the cross of Christ has resonated. It is God taking seriously our reality. God being true to life, if you like, taking seriously our brokenness, our evil, our depths, refusing to brush them under some kind of cosmic eternal carpet, saying that our decisions have the dignity of being judged, that they have consequences, and yet demonstrating the heights that we are valuable, that we have significance, that God deemed us precious enough to save. That we were unable to bridge that gap. He was willing to bridge that gap for us. Let me land with just a few final thoughts. I've been talking about making sense of the whole. Maybe the thought that captures it for me most of all is C.S. Lewis saying, I believe in Christianity like I believe the sun has risen. Not just because I can see it, but because by it I see everything else. I found that faith in God has helped make sense of the whole, and through it, I see everything else. We started with a passage. I'm going to land. Usually you would start with a passage and unpick it and unwrap it together. Today's been unusual, I know, for this church and for us, but I'm just going to land back in that passage, just take one verse and land us there. It's Ephesians 3:12. In him and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. In him and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. Is faith rational? It's funny, when we think about faith, we almost always think about faith that something, faith in propositions, believing, for example, that God exists. It's a detached thing, it's a propositional, conceptual thing that we often think about when we talk about faith. That's not how the Bible talks about faith at all. Faith in him. When I say I have faith in Toby, my husband, you'd hope as a complete kind of common lowest denominator that he exists is intrinsic to the mix. Faith that Toby exists doesn't quite cut it. Faith in Toby. Faith that gives me the privilege of approaching. Faith that gives me the privilege of encounter. Faith that says I've trusted this person and I can vouch that they are trustworthy, that they are worthy of my faith. That's the invitation of the Christian faith. Not to just believe a bunch of things about God, but to know the God at the center of the story. Thanks for listening. I think we're going to have just a couple of songs, and then I'll come back with my friend Marie and do some Q&A, and we'll land it together.